The morning sun hung low over the dusty town square, casting long shadows on the warped wooden planks of the auction platform. The square, normally filled with murmurs of livestock and trade, now thrummed with something darker anticipation. At the center of the stage sat a woven basket, its edges frayed, the bottom stained from years of use. Inside, swaddled in scraps of torn linen, lay an infant no more than 6 months old. His skin, dark as rich soil, glistened under the oppressive sun. Tiny fists punched at the air with desperate confusion. His cries, thin and raw, sliced through the murmurs like a blade. The auctioneer stood tall, sweat clinging to his temples, voice as cold as iron. "What am I bid for this here child?" he bellowed, tapping his gavel against the wood. "Strong stock, fine for field work in 10 years' time." "Do I hear $20? Hands rose without hesitation. Men in sun-beaten hats, their voices casual, threw out numbers like they were bidding on calves. 20. $25. The bids climbed as the baby whimpered louder, sensing the commotion but not understanding it. The crowd pressed forward, dust swirling around their boots, as if drawn by something primal. A woman standing near the front turned her face away, her jaw clenched, eyes wet. But the men kept bidding, and the baby kept crying. His cry wasn't just that of hunger or discomfort. It was the raw sound of being alone in a world that had already decided his worth. A world where he was less than a person, where his name didn't matter, where survival would be a miracle. At the edge of the crowd, silent and still atop a chestnut horse, sat Silas Garrett. His figure cast a long shadow across the dirt road, one hand holding the reins, the other resting like stone on the saddle horn. He wore a dust-worn duster and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, but those who glanced his way knew him instantly. Silas wasn't a man you mistook for someone else. At 45, he'd carved out a reputation as the most successful rancher in 3 counties, ruthless in business, efficient in labor, and known for paying well when he saw value. But success had not brought warmth. Not since fever swept through his home 5 winters ago, taking with it his wife and only daughter. Since then, Silas had spoken to no one unless forced by necessity. He rode alone, ate alone, and slept in a house too large for one soul. Grief had hollowed him out, and solitude had become his shield. As the bidding continued, the auctioneer's eyes found him. The crowd turned, anticipating the inevitable. Silas Garrett always bid when there was strong young labor to be had. His ranch needed workers, and no one questioned how he acquired them. "Mr. Garrett," the auctioneer called, his voice eager. "Surely you'll bid on this fine specimen. Strong bones, good lungs. Current bid is $35. All eyes now rested on Silas. Even the baby's cries seemed to quiet for a second, as if waiting. Silas didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the child, unreadable behind years of pain. Something flickered behind his eyes, something raw, something barely remembered. Not even the sun could burn through the chill that hung in the air at that moment. For a long, breathless second, Silas Garrett remained motionless. Then, slowly, he shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked beneath him as he sat straighter, his jaw tightening. He looked at the child again, really looked this time, not with the eyes of a rancher seeking labor, but with the gaze of a father who had once watched a fever steal the breath from his baby girl's chest. He saw the way the cloth clung to the child's thin limbs, how his fists curled like his daughter's used to when she was frightened. He saw fear, he saw innocence, he saw life barely clinging to itself. Then he spoke. No, Just one word. But it rang out like a gunshot in the stillness of the square. "I won't bid," he added, louder this time. A hush fell over the crowd. The auctioneer froze, his gavel suspended in midair. Men stared in disbelief. Silas Garrett didn't say no. Silas Garrett bought what he wanted, and what he wanted, he took. This broke the script. This shattered expectations. The murmurs started low, spreading like fire across dry grass. Some called him weak. Others whispered that grief had finally unstrung his mind. But Silas didn't flinch. He turned his horse with a deliberate hand, spurring it away from the platform. The crowd parted in stunned silence as he rode through. Behind him, the bidding resumed, louder now, as if trying to erase his defiance. But no one forgot the moment. The richest, most feared man in the county said no. He didn't look back. But something had shifted in the air, an invisible fault line had cracked open. He had no way of knowing it yet, but that single word had set into motion something far greater than himself, something that would wake the ghosts he tried to bury and bring 50 souls to his gate before sunrise. The ride home should have been silent, but the baby's cries followed Silas like a ghost on horseback. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat he once held in his hands. The wind through the open plains didn't cool his skin, it scraped it raw. His ranch came into view, stretched wide and quiet across the valley like a kingdom long abandoned. Fields of grazing cattle rolled toward the horizon, indifferent to their master's turmoil. The main house stood like a tomb, sturdy, silent, and hollow. Silas dismounted with practiced ease, but the stillness struck differently this time. He walked through the porch, boots thudding on wood that hadn't heard laughter in half a decade. Inside, the furniture remained exactly where it had always been. The same table where his wife once served stew. The same chair where his daughter had sat, brushing the knots from her doll's hair. The silence that once comforted him now pressed in like a judgment. He poured a glass of water, but paused midway, hearing something that wasn't there. That cry again. He closed his eyes, but the sound remained high-pitched, innocent, aching. A cry no child should make. A cry he'd failed to silence once before. He hadn't saved his daughter, and he'd walked away today when he could have saved another. But hadn't he already buried enough ghosts? Silas gripped the windowsill and stared across his land. He didn't know it yet, but something was coming. Something that would drag his past into the open and force him to decide hide forever, or rise. It began with hoofprints. Not just one set, dozens, pressed deep into the dirt surrounding his property, winding between his fence posts. Some fresh, some half-erased by wind. They circled his barn, his water troughs, even the far ridge overlooking the ranch house. Whoever they were, they hadn't been wandering. They'd been watching. Silas's instincts prickled. He wasn't a man easily caught off guard. He grabbed his rifle and followed the prints, his boots crunching the dry earth as he scanned the hills. The sun hovered low, casting shadows long and uncertain. And then, he saw them, figures riders gathering at the tree line. 10, 20, 30. By the time the last had emerged, there were 50 of them, men and women on worn horses, their bodies wrapped in coats faded by sun and time, their eyes as sharp as broken glass. Many were black, others Mexican, a few native. All bore the posture of people who had been hunted once, but now hunted back. They didn't approach with torches or rifles. They came with stillness, heavy as judgment. Silas stood by his porch, rifle lowered but not loose, heart hammering. The riders said nothing. They only watched. And behind that watchfulness was something deeper. They didn't look at him with rage. They looked at him with a quiet demand, a plea without sound, the kind of gaze only carried by those who had lost too much to beg aloud. 50 souls who had each buried something. Now they had come for the one man who had dared to say no. From within the ranks of riders, one woman dismounted. She wore a faded blue dress that might have once been Sunday best, now dulled by dust and sorrow. Her hair was pulled back tight, her posture straight as a post. She walked like a woman with no time for hesitation, like a woman who had learned long ago that survival leaves no room for trembling. She stopped just outside rifle range and looked Silas in the eye. Her voice, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. "Silas Garrett," she said, "we need to talk." Silas didn't lower his rifle. "This is private land," he replied coldly. "Say what you came to say, then ride on." Dinah's gaze didn't waver. "We saw what you did back in town. You could have taken that baby like you've taken others before, but you didn't." Silas's jaw tensed. "You saw more than a body to break," she continued. "You saw a child." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "You don't know anything about me." Dinah stepped forward, slowly. "I know what it looks like when grief hardens a man. I know what silence does to a house. I know because I lost my son 15 years ago, sold south before I could scream his name. I've been waiting ever since for someone, anyone, who still remembers what mercy looks like." Silas's grip faltered, just slightly, and today, for the first time in a long time, she whispered, "You remembered." Dinah didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand or accuse. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She offered hope. "You don't owe us anything." "Mr. Garrett," she said softly, "you don't even know that baby's name. But you saw him. That's more than most ever do. You were the only man in that square who didn't see a price tag. You saw a soul." Silas looked past her, at the riders spread out across his land like ghosts refusing to be forgotten. Their eyes stayed on him, not with expectation, but with the heavy ache of longing, eyes that asked not for salvation, but for solidarity. He felt their weight without words. "You think one word can undo a lifetime of silence?" he asked. "No," Dinah said, "but one word can start a different life." Silas stood on the edge of something he couldn't name, half rooted in the grave he'd built for himself, half reaching towards something painful and terrifying and real. "They'll come for that child," Dinah warned. "They'll work him until he breaks, unless someone stops them." Her voice cracked barely, but it was enough. "We're not asking you to save him alone," she finished. "We're asking you to stand with us. Just once. Just this once." Silas looked at his house. At the porch no one sat on. At the chair where no one rocked. And then back at the 50 riders who had somehow found their way to him, not with anger, but with faith. The kind of faith that still believed the loneliest man in the county might remember how to be human. That night, Silas couldn't sleep. The walls of his ranch, once a fortress of solitude, now felt too thin, like wind could blow straight through them and carry his regrets out into the darkness. He paced the floor with a lantern in one hand and a loaded rifle in the other. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the windows scraped against his nerves like flint against steel. It wasn't just the conversation with Dinah that haunted him. It was the sense that something else had already begun moving. By dawn, he saddled his horse and rode the perimeter of his land, eyes sharp. That's when he saw them more hoofprints, clearer this time, deep grooves in the earth from multiple riders. Not random, not lost. Each set led to a point of high ground overlooking his house. Silas dismounted, crouching by one of the tracks, fresh. At least 3 or 4 riders, circling, watching, studying him. They knew his routines. When he fed the horses, when he locked up the barn, when he lit his last lamp for the night, someone had mapped his life. He wasn't afraid. Not in the traditional sense he'd faced wolves, wild bulls, and men with blood in their teeth. But this was different. This was calculated, strategic, and it meant only one thing: the people who held power in this land had noticed what happened in that town square. They saw his refusal not as a private decision, but as a threat to the order they'd built. Silas understood now. He'd made himself a target. Later that morning, Silas rode into town under the pretense of buying feed. The general store was quiet, but the stares he drew were not. Men turned their heads quickly, pretending they hadn't seen him. A few women whispered behind their hands. The air had changed. At the far end of the street, standing beside a gleaming black carriage, was Marcus Webb. Silas didn't need an introduction. Webb's reputation reached further than his cattle empire. He was one of the few men in the territory with more money and more cruelty than Silas. A man who didn't buy people to build wealth, but to break them. He owned land as far as the eye could see and filled it with bodies that toiled until they collapsed. And he had purchased the baby. Silas clenched his jaw, watching the man shake hands with the sheriff like old friends at a church picnic. Webb's smile was thin and polished, but his eyes never smiled. They scanned everything like a butcher examining livestock before the knife. Webb caught Silas looking. He smiled wider and tipped his hat, like a gentleman. Silas didn't tip his back. He turned and left without buying a damn thing. On the ride home, the wind stung his face, but it wasn't the cold. It was fury. That man had taken the child. That man, who saw human life as something to crush for profit, was the one holding the baby's fate. And if Silas didn't act soon, that child would die not by bullet or blade, but by 100 days of slow, invisible suffering. That night, Silas sat alone at his kitchen table, candlelight flickering against the empty walls. Dina's words echoed in his mind. The baby's cries had been distant at first, but now they seemed to fill every room of the house. He stared at his rifle on the table. He had used it to defend his land for decades, shot wolves, scare off drunks, kept peace with force when words failed. But this time, something in his gut told him it wasn't the right tool. If he stormed Webb's ranch with guns, there would be blood. Innocent blood. Maybe even the baby's. Silas took a long breath and reached for a pen instead. He began writing numbers, cattle contracts, beef shipments, Webb's known partners. He thought like a rancher. But now he had to think like a tactician. Webb was a businessman, cold, calculating. What he feared most wasn't bullets. It was loss. Loss of money. Loss of reputation. Loss of control. Silas circled a figure on the paper, then looked up. He didn't need to draw blood. He needed to draw leverage. Dina had come expecting a warrior. What they needed now was a negotiator, a man who knew how to make evil men bleed where it hurt most their pockets. He looked out the window, across the empty pasture. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. A plan was forming, and it might just save that baby without another child dying in his arms. The next morning, as the frost still clung to the grass, Silas met Dina outside his barn. She stood tall, her wounded arm wrapped tight, her dress now layered under a coat 2 sizes too big. But she looked stronger, like purpose was pumping through her veins. "Did you think of something?" she asked. Silas nodded. "Webb lives for profit. He sells cattle across the territory. Every butcher and rail supplier between here and the mountains depends on his meat." She squinted. "Go on." "He also depends on me," Silas continued. "My cattle make up nearly half his supply. If I cut ties, others will follow. If I make it known he's keeping that baby, suddenly, he's bad for business." Dina looked skeptical. "You think bad press will change his mind?" Silas's eyes were cold, but steady. "I think greed makes men more flexible than pride ever could." There was silence, the kind of silence that weighed more than words. Then she asked, softer this time, "Why are you really doing this?" Silas hesitated. His jaw twitched. "Because I know what it's like to hear a child cry, and know you can't stop it. And because maybe this is my chance to finally do something that matters." Dinah stepped closer. "You know this won't be clean. If Webb doesn't flinch, we go in. Fast, hard." Silas nodded. "Then we do both. Talk first, fight if we must." It wasn't just a strategy. It was a man choosing hope over surrender for the first time in years. The road to Webb's ranch was long, flat, and exposed. No cover, no shadows, just dry dust and sunlight, and the steady rhythm of Silas Garrett's horse beneath him. He rode alone. Behind him, hidden in the hills and circling pastures, 50 riders waited, silent, ready. Silas didn't bring a rifle. He didn't bring armor or allies. He brought something more dangerous: clarity. As the ranch gates appeared in the distance, tall iron teeth set into a stone wall. His heart pounded like a war drum. The place looked more like a fortress than farmland. Armed guards walked the perimeter, rifles slung over their shoulders. 2 watchtowers stood like sentinels, unmoving but ever alert. He kept his hands visible as he approached. The guards recognized him instantly. Silas Garrett, the man who never bent, the man who never begged. They let him through. The courtyard was clean and quiet, not a child's cry in earshot. Silas dismounted, boots crunching gravel as he walked forward. He passed flower beds that felt out of place, beauty grown beside cruelty. Then Marcus Webb appeared, thin, composed, every inch of him coiled like a viper. His clothes were fine linen, his boots polished, his smile slow and predatory. "Silas Garrett," Webb drawled, extending a gloved hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Silas took the hand. Cold, dry, dead inside. "Business," he said flatly, "always business." Inside Webb's study, everything gleamed: mahogany furniture, glass decanters, ledgers bound in leather. The room reeked of power and order, but beneath it all lay something more rotten. The shelves weren't filled with books. They were filled with records, sales, births, labor rotations, people reduced to paperwork. Silas stood tall, calm. Webb gestured toward the decanter, but Silas declined. "I heard you made a purchase at the last auction," he began. Webb's eyes glinted. "The infant, yes, healthy, strong lungs, bit loud, but that'll break with time. Good investment." Silas didn't flinch, but something inside him cracked. "I'll take him off your hands," he said. "Triple what you paid." Webb raised a brow. "And," Silas added, "I'll guarantee you first pick of my cattle for the next 5 years at below market rate." It was more than generous. It was enough to make any rancher fold. Webb didn't. He leaned back, folding his hands. "That's curious. Why that child you want to train him up young? Is that it?" Silas nodded slowly. "Fresh stock learns faster. No bad habits to unlearn. Just clean slate. Webb chuckled. You always were efficient. But behind that laugh, his gaze sharpened, calculating, hunting. You've been acting strange lately. Garrett, that little scene at the auction. And now, rumors. Riders on your land, people whispering. Silas kept his voice flat. I'm just here to make a deal. Webb smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Are you, Webb? Rose slowly from his desk and moved to the window. Outside, the guard still circled, business as usual. But there was a tightness in the air now, like a storm pressing against the glass. I'll tell you what I think, Webb said without turning. I think you're part of something. I think you're running a little abolitionist experiment, smuggling property, undermining order. He turned, eyes gleaming. That makes you very dangerous to men like me. Silas felt it, then the noose tightening. He hadn't walked into a negotiation. He'd walked into a trap. From somewhere deeper in the house, a cry rang out. Small, weak, human. The baby was still here. Alive for now. Webb saw his flinch and smiled wider. Here's my counteroffer. You leave my land right now, and I don't shoot you for trespassing. Stay 1 minute longer, and I'll make sure that child dies slowly, right in front of you. Silas's heart slammed against his ribs. Webb wasn't bluffing. He was the kind of man who didn't bluff, he delivered. For one long second, Silas considered backing down. Then he remembered Dina's eyes, the 50 riders in the hills, and the little girl he couldn't save. He stepped forward, voice like granite. You're right. I am dangerous to men like you. But not because I carry a gun. Webb's smile wavered. I'm dangerous because I stopped being afraid. Shouts erupted outside. Webb turned to the window, scowling. His guards were on the move, yelling orders, rifles drawn but confused. From the hills, riders had begun to appear, one by one, then in waves, dozens, then more. Dina's group, and they weren't hiding anymore. Webb spun toward Silas, fury rising. What is this? Silas stood calm. This is consequence. He didn't wait for Webb to move. He lunged. The two men crashed into the desk, paper scattering, a bottle shattering on the floor. Webb clawed for the pistol at his belt, but Silas struck first, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs and slamming him against the shelves. Outside, gunfire cracked. Inside, chaos. Footsteps pounded from upstairs. Dina's voice shouted, second door on the left, and then another crash. Silas pinned Webb to the ground, panting, furious. It's over, he growled. You've built this house on pain long enough. Webb thrashed beneath him, face red, veins bulging. You fools think you can stop this. You think one baby matters. There are hundreds more. Silas looked down at him, eyes clear, voice calm. Then maybe we start with one. From the stairs, Dina's voice rose again. I've got him. Silas turned to see her blood on her sleeve, a baby in her arms, wrapped in a clean cloth. The child was small, too small, but alive. His eyes were open, and for the first time, he wasn't crying. He was watching, upstairs. The hallway reeked of sweat and dust. Doors lined the walls, all closed. Behind one of them, the cries had come sharp, then fading, then rising again like waves of panic. Dina didn't hesitate. Her boots slammed against the wood, splinters flying with every step. She reached the second door on the left, shoulder braced, heart thundering. It was locked, no time for subtlety. She raised her pistol and fired once into the lock. The crack of the shot echoed through the house like a final verdict. The door flew open. Inside, A man, one of Webb's overseers, stood at the open window. The infant bundled in his arms, one leg already over the sill. "Put him down," Dina ordered, gun raised. The man turned, surprised, then desperate. "You shoot. You drop him." "I don't need to shoot," she growled, and lunged. They crashed hard into the floorboards. The man groaned as his head struck the bedpost, but Dina didn't stop to check. She scooped up the baby, cradling the fragile body to her chest, whispering, "I've got you. I've got you." The child was trembling, feverish, skin too hot, but he was breathing. His tiny hand gripped her coat. His eyes, unfocused but alert, met hers for the briefest moment. Then, in a whisper that broke her in half, he made a sound that wasn't quite a cry. It was trust. Dinah's eyes burned. She pressed a kiss to his forehead and turned back toward the chaos below. While Dina fought for the child upstairs, the world outside Webb's fortress was on fire with conscience, not bullets. From every ridge, valley, and tree line, riders surged forward, not with torches or weapons, but with resolve. They didn't come to burn, they came to stand. Farmers, freedmen, former slaves, Mexicans, Apaches, white settlers, all answering a silent call that had echoed from one porch to another. Word of the baby had spread like wildfire. People came not for war, but for witness. To make sure what happened here could not be buried. Webb's guards, once cocky and cruel, now hesitated. They were outnumbered, outspirited. The first one laid down his rifle, then another, and another. Soon the gates were opened from within, not forced, but surrendered. No one wanted to die for a man who treated children like cattle. In the courtyard, Silas emerged, dragging Webb by the collar, face bruised, shirt torn. He threw the man to the dirt like refuse. The crowd parted as Dina descended the steps, the baby safe in her arms, her coat stained with blood and dust. Her eyes locked with Silas's. "It's over," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of what they'd done. A life had been pulled back from the edge, and the world had witnessed it. The dust had barely settled when Marcus Webb sat slumped against the steps of his own house, wrists tied, blood crusted along his jaw. His fine shirt was torn and stained, his boots scuffed, and his pride shattered. But his eyes still burned. "You fools think you've done something noble," he spat. "This won't change anything." No one answered. He twisted his neck to glare at Silas, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching not with hatred, but with something colder finality. "There are 100 more like me out there," Webb continued, voice rising, desperate now. 100 men who'll keep buying, keep selling. "You haven't ended a damn thing." Silas said nothing. "You've declared war," Webb hissed, "and you don't even realize it." Dina stepped beside Silas, the baby still in her arms, wrapped in clean cloth and resting now in deep, exhausted sleep. Webb's gaze snapped to the child, lips curling. "You think saving one child changes the system?" Silas finally spoke, his voice low and unshakable. "No," he said, "but it changes me." The air grew still. Because for the first time, everyone understood this wasn't just about justice. It was about a man who had once buried his heart, now digging it up, piece by piece. Webb's rant faded into the background as the crowd gathered in a loose circle around Silas and Dina. 50 riders, dusty and bruised, faces etched by time and pain, but standing tall, heads high. They had come for a child, but they had found something more. Silas looked around at them not as a landowner surveying labor, but as a man among equals. He saw backs that had once bent under whips, eyes that had watched sons and daughters sold to strangers, hands that had planted, built, bled, and yet here they stood, not with revenge, but with resolve. He took a slow step forward and spoke not to Webb, but to the people. "You were right," he said. "Saving one child doesn't end this." But what if today was the first crack in the wall? Murmurs moved through the crowd. He looked to Dinah. "You said fear is just love with nowhere to go." She nodded once, eyes misting. "Well, I've lived afraid for 5 years, afraid of caring, afraid of losing again, afraid that loving anything meant waiting for it to be taken." He paused. "But maybe love isn't weakness. Maybe it's the one thing strong enough to stop men like Webb." A hush fell over the courtyard, because deep down, every person there had longed to hear those words from someone who once stood on the other side of the line. That night, Silas didn't return to his empty home alone. The riders followed him, not to fight, not to rest, but because something unspoken had changed. Dinah rode beside him, the baby bundled safe in her arms. As they crested the final ridge before Silas's ranch, the valley opened before them, his land, vast and untouched, but no longer desolate. For 5 years, Silas had lived behind invisible walls, self-built, self-enforced. Isolation had been his armor, silence, his punishment. But those walls had cracked. He glanced at the child, Samuel, they had begun to call him. He saw in that tiny face not just the baby he'd saved, but the echo of the one he'd lost. And instead of pain, he felt breath, a stirring in the chest, the beginning of something unfamiliar, not peace, not yet, but purpose. At the front gate, he turned to the group. "You're welcome to stay," he said, the words foreign on his tongue. "For a night, or longer. If you need." One by one, they dismounted. The gate opened, and for the first time in years, Silas Garrett walked into his own home, not as a ghost among shadows, but as a man choosing to live again. Morning light spilled through the front windows of Silas's house for the first time in years. Not just light, but life. The baby, now bathed and warm, slept peacefully in a crib made hastily from an old drawer lined with soft cloth. His chest rose and fell in the hush of safety. Dinah stood nearby, arms folded, watching him. Silas entered the room, his boots softer than usual against the floorboards, as if instinctively quieting his presence. He looked down at the sleeping child, hands behind his back. "He needs a name," Dinah said gently. Silas nodded slowly. "Did Webb ever say?" Dinah shook her head. To him, it was just property, a number on a bill of sale. Silas looked again, studying the boy's delicate features, the dark curls, the tiny fists, the stubborn flicker of life still pulsing behind closed eyelids. "Then we give him one," he murmured. Dinah tilted her head. What name would you give a boy who survived all that? Silas didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, remembering another child, blonde hair, wide eyes, burning with fever, a hand that had once gripped his finger before going still. "Samuel," he said at last. "His name is Samuel." Dinah smiled. "A strong name, a name worth remembering," Silas whispered. And in that moment, Samuel ceased to be a victim of the world. He became its answer. The days that followed were filled with work and wonder. People who had once only gathered in fear now worked side by side. They repaired fences. They cooked together. They laughed. They breathed. Children ran where silence had ruled, and at the center of it all stood the man who had once sworn never to feel again. Silas didn't know what had changed more, the house or himself. Every time he stepped outside, he saw hands fixing what had been broken, tools mending walls, music mending silence, presence mending grief. No one asked him to lead. They simply followed his example because he had done the one thing they all longed to believe was possible. He had changed. Samuel became everyone's responsibility. One minute he was in Dina's arms, the next being rocked by a former slave who once lost 3 children of his own, then passed to a young Apache woman who whispered stories into his ear, then to a white farmer who had lost his wife in childbirth. Each of them saw a piece of their own sorrow in him, and each of them chose to turn sorrow into something sacred. By the end of the week, Samuel had 50 guardians. Silas stood on the porch one evening, arms crossed, watching as the baby was passed from hand to hand like a sacred flame. For the first time in years, he smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer ruled him. It started with Dina. She never left. She cooked in the same kitchen Silas once avoided. She folded tiny clothes. She sang lullabies to a child who had never heard music before. She took up space in his house without asking, and somehow it felt right, natural, like the house had been waiting for her voice. Others followed. A widower with shaking hands asked to help with the cattle. A grandmother who had lost everyone in the war began tending the vegetable garden. A boy barely old enough to carry water asked to learn how to saddle a horse. And Silas, the loner rancher, let them stay. Not because he needed labor, but because he needed life. His house became something else, a refuge. Not just from cruelty, but from despair. It was no longer just a ranch. It was a sanctuary built from pieces of broken people who had refused to stay broken. Late one night, Silas sat at the edge of his porch as Samuel slept upstairs. Dinah joined him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "You ever think this was possible?" she asked. Silas took a long breath, the kind that came not from exhaustion but peace. "I used to think family was something you buried." He looked at her, voice steady. "Now I think maybe it's something you choose." The sky that evening was brushed in fire streaks of gold and crimson, bleeding into soft violet. The kind of sunset that made you stop whatever you were doing and just look. The kind that didn't ask permission to be beautiful. Samuel lay nestled in Dina's arms, a blanket wrapped around his tiny frame, his head resting beneath her chin. Silas stood beside them, one hand on the porch railing, the other resting over his chest as if to keep something inside from spilling out. The others gathered in the yard, some standing, some sitting, all quiet. Not because they were tired, but because the moment called for silence. Reverence. A fire crackled in a stone pit. Horses grazed nearby. Children's laughter echoed from the barn. The house, once haunted by memory, now pulsed with breath and warmth. Dina looked at Silas. "He'll need a family," she said softly, nodding toward Samuel. "Not just a roof or a name, but people, arms, love." Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the group, faces from every walk of life, once strangers, now bound by a choice, not blood, not law, but care, connection, courage. "Maybe he doesn't need just one family," Silas finally said. "Maybe he needs all of us." A murmur of agreement moved through the group. No declarations, no ceremonies, just understanding. In the stillness that followed, Silas bent slightly toward the child. "You're home now," he whispered, and that was the moment, the one that mattered more than any battle or speech. Because sometimes The greatest victories don't end with flags or fanfare, but with a child falling asleep in peace, surrounded by the quiet strength of people who chose to love him. The loner rancher had found his purpose. The wounded community had found its courage. And a child who was once auctioned off like livestock had found something no money could ever buy, a home built not of wood and stone, but of hearts willing to fight for him.